R1, E1, R2, E2 refer to. When you look at part B, okay, this is only for part B. For part A, there's no evaluation. Okay, so for part B, R1, E1, R2, E2, we know that E1, E2 tends to be if you like, a rebuttal of your position set out in R1 or R2, right? But I also said we have the bar being raised in, let's say, in RI, because if you just have a rebuttal, it's not enough. They also want an interim conclusion. So after you have your R1, E1, they have an interim conclusion where they say, oh, overall, this depends on, let's say, nature or state of economy. Likewise, they have an interim conclusion. And you probably recall I said it's a good idea, all right, to start having interim conclusions before you reach your summative conclusion. Why? For some people, they never reach that summative conclusion. They run out of time, okay? So I would say, because of that, we try to have this interim point. It doesn't have to be very long, 2-3 sentences for your interim conclusion. Okay, but more importantly, because your E1 serves as a rebuttal of R1, I feel going to your mid-years, it is a very good idea to choose policy questions where possible, right? Choose policy questions where possible, especially those with 2 options. Okay, especially those where they give you 2 options. So what are the questions where they give you 2 options? Like if they ask you to discuss whether, this is the most obvious, policy 1 or policy 2 is more appropriate in doing something. Okay, and you know that extends to a lot of topics. Why? In DDSS, I could ask you whether a price ceiling or a subsidy is more appropriate in helping low-income consumers afford food, right? Speaking of price controls, in Thailand, they just dug out the rice stocks from 10 years back. And the prime minister and the ministers, they are eating the rice to show you it's still safe, even though it's been kept in stock for 10 years. Well, that's something you learn in price floor with government support, where the government buys out the surplus, okay? Well, anyway, that's price floor. So in demand and supply, they can ask you about price ceiling or a subsidy, price floor or subsidy, right? Then in, let's say, market failure, in market failure, they can also ask you about, let's say, a tax, or on top of a tax, maybe a regulation or campaigns, okay? They can ask you which one is more ideal, right? In dealing with, let's say, externalities as well, okay? Then market structure. Market structure, they may ask you about price regulation. Okay, price regulation versus liberalization versus competition. Okay, of course, we know in the world of macroecons, there are many policies, right? Fiscal policy, monetary policy, supply side policies. They can all be the policy options that are posed. Okay. Okay. So these are all possible. And if you look at these questions, very simple. Your R1, okay, by the way, even if it doesn't look like this, they can also ask you to discuss whether a certain policy is most appropriate. Whether this particular policy is most appropriate in dealing with a certain problem. Why? When they have the word most or best or the only solution, you kind of know these are comparative terms, right? And being a comparative term, you have to bring out an alternative policy. Okay? So these are what I call comparative terms. Right? So if you see these questions, I would recommend just pounce on it. Why? You may say, hey, but this is part B. Shouldn't I look at part A as well? Part B, if you can settle your evaluation, you're inching very close to what 7 plus 3, 8 plus 4, that kind of grade. And even if you score 6 marks for part A, all right, but part B you get a 2-digit. Overall, it still brings you a lot closer to your A. I know every time I just say A, okay, it sounds like we are very pragmatic here, okay, but this is about strategizing, all right? So if you look at these questions, I think it naturally follows that R1 is your policy 1 plus, E1 is your policy 1 minus, R2 policy 2 plus, E2 policy 2 minus. Of course, interim conclusion I've mentioned before. Okay. Because a lot of students, when they're in the exams, they study a lot, okay? But they find something frustrating, okay, that occurs during the paper, which is the inability to deploy what you have learned. Why? Because you're trying to stuff it into an R1, E1, R2, E2 structure. It's very frustrating, you know? Then you find that you can't really get close to answering the question. So, assuming your mid-years give you the